Welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here.
Congratulations on your new book, Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. So, Rebecca, what do women have, or do women have anything to be angry about in America?
No, we're good.
You're good?
We're good, yeah.
All right,
yeah.
This has been fun. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. This is it is really timely that this book would come out, not just after the midterms, but really after the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. Mm-hmm. It felt like that was a moment in America where many women's voices were being heard, and many women were saying, hey, this story sounds familiar to me. Mm-hmm. We are never heard. What are you talking about when you say the power of women's anger?
Well, in part, I'm looking at the history of women's anger as it has been expressed within political contexts in this country, and how that anger has often been the catalyst for some of the social movements that have transformed the country, from abolition and suffrage to the labor movement, obviously to the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, and the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s. At the beginning of so many of those movements, there were angry women angry at injustice, at inequality. But we're not very often told the story of their anger as having been righteous. We are told that women's anger is laughable, marginal, hysterical.
Right.
Women of color's anger is treated as volatile and dangerous, threatening. We're not encouraged to look at women's anger as something that brings us political progress, but it really has over and over again in this country. And so part of the book is an attempt to kind of tell that story and acknowledge the political consequences of women who are angry at inequality.
It is an interesting time to see this conversation start, because you have the midterms where we have now, I think it's over 100 women in the House, right? Mm-hmm. 9 governorships went to women. Mm-hmm. So women have come out in full force saying, we're running, we want to be a part of running this country and making the change for ourselves.
And a lot of their candidacies stem from their anger. In the early months of the Trump administration, after the 2016 election, when we first began to get a sense of how many women were going to step up and run for office on federal levels, on state and local levels, so many of them said, I'm furious. I'm angry at what just happened.
Right.
I'm angry at my lack of representation. I'm angry that this guy who admitted to grabbing women by the pussy can then go on and be elected president.
Right.
And I am going to do something to change this. And so many of these candidacies stem from anger. A lot of them were at the Women's March. It was a protest that was born in part of fury, a desire to hold up big profane signs and express how angry women were. And people didn't necessarily take it seriously, even though it was the biggest single-day political protest in this country's history. They said, oh, it was the hats, right?
Right, the hats.
It was the pink hats.
The pink hats.
And I look back at how people talked about that march the next day in mainstream political coverage and sort of said, oh, but, they had the big gathering with the hats, but what are they going to really do? Well, they ran for office in unprecedented numbers. And yesterday, women of color won seats. In record numbers, and that changes something that's always been broken in this country. It doesn't fix it, but we have always lived with this promise that we live in a representative democracy, but in fact, our government institutions have not represented us, and they still don't. Just, it's still
Right,
less
right,
than
right.
25%. Don't worry, we're not anywhere close to actual representation. But that kind of thing, new faces, new models for what leadership might look like, that actually does begin to get us moderately closer to something like the founding promise that has always gone unmet.
When you look at the way women's anger is met in many conversations, there is a disconnect between anger when it comes from a man and then anger when it comes from a woman. As you say, when I was watching the Kavanaugh hearings, for instance, I remember thinking to myself, Dr. Ford was composed and she was in a really tough situation. I thought to myself, if she had reacted the way Brett Kavanaugh did, berating people and screaming and shouting, she would have been dragged out of there and people would have been like, yo, this bitch is crazy.
Yeah.
People would have said things like that. They would have, that's the notion around...
We can't even imagine it. You imagine her screaming, I like beer, and it's like... Or turning the questions back on, how
Exactly.
he said to Klobuchar, well, have you ever blacked out? Can you imagine
Right.
her turning those questions back on the Senate Judiciary? She would have been arrested.
So then how do women then use that anger in a way? Because, I won't deny that I've also had to reframe how I think of it in my head, where I go oh, yeah, it's just... People get angry. People can use their anger in positive ways, but how do you then move it forward for women? How do you then say to women, like, this is how we use our anger in a way that doesn't get blocked by men?
Part of the trick is not telling women how to express or not express their anger differently. It's doing what you just said, which is you've had to adjust your ears to how you hear women's anger. So we can't necessarily work our way through a system that doesn't make room for our fury.
Right.
But we can start to listen to the fury of other women differently and understand it as valid. We can start to listen for women's anger and think, oh, wait, maybe that's pointing me towards something that's broken and needs to be fixed, instead of hearing, she's crazy.
Right.
And that's part of the message.
In the book, there are so many interesting points that you draw from history, and you talk about what's happening to us today. When we talk about Hillary Clinton, and you look at the passages in the book about her, there is an interesting dilemma that Hillary faced, and that was, if Hillary was angry, people said she's annoying, she's irritating. If she wasn't angry, they said she doesn't have the passion. So then, does it become, a catch-22 for women who are in positions of power?
It has been historically. That's one of the reasons that we need to think differently about how we're hearing, receiving, and responding to women's voices raised in passion or dissent. Hillary was running against two men in the Democratic primary and then in the general election who used anger beautifully. They were able to channel the anger of their supporters, and they were credited for it. But every time she spoke too close to a microphone, somebody said, stop yelling at us. And at the same time, she faced this criticism. She doesn't have any of the real emotion to connect with her voters. So this is a bind that women have been in for a long time. If they yell, they're seen as off-putting, especially if they're in positions of power or challenging men for positions of power. They're seen as castrating. Their anger discredits them. And at the same time, if they don't show it, then how can we know that we're to take them seriously about what they say? These are the systems part of the book is outlining these patterns and then saying we actually need to change the systems. So we need to start listening to the voices of women differently and engaging different models. And I think we are. I think some of the candidates who won yesterday are women who've been very open about what they've been angry about, that their dissatisfactions have led them to seek elected office.
Right.
And that's something that's beginning to change our models for how we can hear women's voices and understand them as politically serious.
There's always been one dilemma for America in and around its voting, and that has been that women's voices are heard, but then in instances like with Donald Trump, or even in the midterms, as we saw yesterday, you have women voters being the reason that people like DeSantis get into powers, and white women specifically.
Yeah, let's be specific. It's white women.
Right, white women have now been identified as a very powerful voting bloc. So, for instance, with Brian Kemp, white women outvoted white men.
According to these exit polls. Now, that is a shocking metric. I mean, I want to make sure that...
No, but I'm saying, okay, but even but in Florida, they go, white women voted for DeSantis. And
as long as we have been tracking these things, and from before we've been tracking these things, white women have very often voted on behalf of white patriarchal power structures and conservative politics. A majority of white women have voted for Republicans in every presidential election except two since 1952. And one of the things that we have to acknowledge in this country, we are a country that is built around a white patriarchy in which white men from the founding have been afforded economic, political, public, social, and sexual power, and other people have been barred from it. White women, via their associations with white men, have enjoyed that proximal power and thus are incentivized to defend it, to uphold it. They benefit from white supremacy, and many of them dependent on patriarchy, which they are then moved to support politically and socially. This is a long-standing reality that we need to be more open about. It's not that we're suddenly going to persuade those conservative women to give up their affiliations to the Republican Party, to conservative politics, and to white patriarchal power structures, but we need to figure out the ways that the white women who are angry on behalf of a more progressive and more inclusive future, can do the work of expanding the electorate, looking to women of color for leadership in terms of how to go forward, acknowledging that members of their demographic are in some ways compromised, and ways in which white women can become angry in progressive ways that wind up getting us to a better place.
That's an interesting idea that you just brought up there real quick before I let you go. The idea that women of color, black women specifically in America, have been at the forefront of so many movements.
From
and,
the beginning.
You know, we saw with like the Roy Moore elections, you saw that black women as a bloc have always been focused and progressively minded. And so what you're saying then is white women need to take a cue from black women. How do you begin that conversation? And is there a disconnect between white women who are saying like, oh, we're the angry ones, we're taking this, and black women saying like, no, we've been angry, we've got this?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes, there is a disconnect. There's anger. And I believe that that anger between potential allies needs to be expressed. And I'm not the first to believe this. Is what Audre Lorde was writing about in the 1980s, that the anger about racism within a women's movement must be expressed if we're to move forward and be productive and generative in terms of where we want to go and form more solid coalitions. But it is absolutely true that black women who have seen no incentive from white patriarchy, they don't get patriarchy and they don't get white supremacy.
Right.
And that has, to some degree, permitted them to be the groundbreaking thinkers, organizers, leaders of so many progressive movements. And yes, when white women get woken up, as they have over the past 2 years, that's necessary, that's correct. White women should be angry about inequity, not just that they experience, but that other vulnerable people around them experience. But there is a tendency, because they have more power, to come in and appropriate and behave as though maybe I am a white woman.
Whoa. Stop the interview.
Invented anger.
Right.
Right? That that's part of what we need to talk about. No. We did not invent it, we did not create it, we did not create protest, and in fact, it is crucial that we look to those who have been angry, active, progressive, and revolutionary before us for cues, direction, and leadership as we move into the future. And that's part of what happened yesterday. Look at the women of color who were elected yesterday. That's one step. That's one step. We need to look at transforming our political parties and our activist coalitions and looking to women of color for leadership.
Thank you so much for being on the show. Wonderful having you. Good and Mad is a really amazing book, and it's available now. Rebecca Traister, everybody.